Hi guys, welcome to a video, and today's video is about how lesbian film has changed throughout the years, starting with the early 20th century and leading up to the current day. It's interesting to see how the portrayal of lesbians and lesbian relationships have evolved over the years on the big screen. It's interesting because films often reflect the cultural and social attitudes of the times in which they were made. So I thought this would be a very interesting video to make for you guys. And of course, most importantly, look at the history of films leading up to the film that gave us Cate Blanchett kissing another woman. That may have been the motivation behind this video. Enjoy!
Film and moving image as we know it came about at the very end of the 19th century, along with the first ever film studio and the cinema following closely behind at the beginning of the 20th century. This grew and grew until not long after lesbianism appeared on the screen. That's one way to sell tickets. In the early 20th century, homosexuality wasn't legal, however the seeds of expression were starting to break through the soil in various art forms regardless. From the beginning to the late 20th century, lesbianism on the screen was often subtext, and if in any way was overt, it was baked into tragedy or linked with immorality. Examples from this time include Pandora's Box, which was a silent German film made in 1929, and it's thought to be the earliest film with a visible lesbian character who dances the tango with another woman and strongly portrays a version of the predatory lesbian stereotype. Classic. We also have Mädchen in Uniform, which is another German film made in 1931 with a female director. It is about a schoolgirl Manuela with a crush on her teacher. Mädchen in Uniform is the first ever lesbian themed film, and it even has a kiss. But it does end with Manuela attempting to kill herself. She is stopped by her fellow classmates, but of course there's no happy ending. It is worth mentioning Hitchcock's films, specifically Rebecca from 1940 and The Birds from 1963. Both of these films contained lesbian subtext and undertones. In Rebecca, we have the character of Mrs. Danvers, a housekeeper who is implied to have a Sapphic fixation on her previous mistress. She is a shady and manipulative character who dies in the end. And in The Birds, there are suggestive lesbian undertones between Melanie and Annie. It's not explicit, but it's there. And Annie dies. Of course, both these films are horror films, but the portrayal is still relevant. We have the film Olivia in 1951, which is another teacher-student romance with a lesbian character committing suicide, and you have the predatory lesbian stereotype with Mademoiselle Julie. In 1967 came The Fox. This film is problematic on many levels, but it's essentially about Jill and Ellen, two women who live together, quite isolated. The names Jill and Ellen are very gay. They have their lives disrupted by a character called Paul, who arrives and has an attraction to Ellen, causing Jill to lose it and become quite emotionally unstable. And guess what? Jill dies in the end. A common theme in this time was also to portray lesbians as unhinged or as part of a mental defect, with suicide and moral ambiguity often attached to these characters. Even in the 1970s, with the legalization of homosexuality in the West, the immorality / not quite wholesome theme carried on in lesbianism on the screen. We also see films in this time use lesbianism as a sexual novelty and use it to shock and allure audiences in. These films often appealed more to the male gaze than to an oppressed minority. This is not to discount the films or say that the films were bad films or poorly made in any way, but let's not consume things blindly. And whilst I might be into blood-sucking lesbian vampires, I'm not into the hypersexualization of lesbians whilst ignoring the oppression of a minority group. Examples of films from this time are Vampire Lovers Colors in 1970, which was adapted from the novel Carmilla, one of the first ever vampire novels, essentially about a lesbian vampire. The film was adapted from this book and is about a vampire with lesbian tendencies who ravishes the townfolk and is generally up to no good. We also have Daughters of Darkness in 1971, which is a horror about an older vampire type woman who seduces the female half of a newlywed heterosexual couple. Do these themes sound familiar? This carried on until the 1980s, where there started to be a bit of a turning point in the portrayal of lesbian characters and their relationships on screen. Notable films from this time include Desert Hearts in 1985, which was a romantic drama and about a love affair between two women, and this film is groundbreaking because it doesn't have a tragic ending or a predatory lesbian character. It's also just a fantastic film and a real turning point for lesbian cinema. We also have The Colour Purple in 1985. Now this is in no way a romantic film, but it is very notable because it is about a young black woman navigating her way through sexism, racism, violence, poverty, and her queer identity. It's one of the earliest films to look seriously at queer women of colour. Then came the 90s and things improved significantly in this decade, mostly due to the rapidly changing social climate and a lot of the groundwork laid out by the LGBT activism in the 70s and 80s. This was coming to fruition in the 90s, and this showed with the representation of the gay community on screen. It was also the decade I was born. I was a very gay baby. My first ever word was carpentry. In the 1990s, lesbianism was no longer solely infused with tragedy, and in fact we started to see so much more diversity and positive representation. There is just so many examples from this era. Moving on to the 21st century, things have expanded significantly with more access to films than just the cinema. People also have access to lesbian films in the comfort of their own homes. Thanks to the internet, any schmuck can just make a film now. In the last couple of decades, queer and lesbian women have been able to take back their own narrative, and with this create films which appeal to a more diverse audience than ever before. Despite this explosion in lesbian media, we still have to remember it is a privilege to have access to these films. There are still parts of the world where films that include lesbianism in any kind of light, which isn't negative, are still subject to be banned, censored, and shunned. A prime example of this was the 2018 film Rafiki, which was banned by the Kenya Film Classification Board due to its homosexual theme, contrary to the law. The board actually asked the film director to change the ending as it was too hopeful and positive. The director refused, which led to the ban of the film. This is why LGBT activism is still important in this day and age, and also why it's important to support LGBT content, especially like Rafiki, and lift minority voices up where we can. So that's more or less a brief history of lesbian film for you. Who knows what the future holds? Lesbian robots or just global warming? We'll see. Okay guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.